She had fallen asleep sitting straight up on a hospital floor at 2:07 a.m., spine pressed to the humming belly of a vending machine that pushed out stale warmth in little mechanical breaths, chin tucked down over a stuffed rabbit with one eye missing, knees drawn to her chest under a thin blue dress that had once belonged to someone else. The corridor light above her flickered every 9 seconds, and each flicker turned the mud on her shins from brown to black to brown again. Her sneakers sat side by side at the edge of the waxed tile, not kicked off in panic, not dropped in a rush, but placed there with care, laces tied in careful double knots that had held through rain. Now she is 7 years old, and very still in a place built for movement, in a federal hallway where doors hiss open and close and clipboards travel faster than names. The antiseptic smell rides over everything, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat, but it cannot cover the wet concrete scent coming in from the loading dock door that never latched right in November weather. Rain had blown in and tracked across the gray tile in crescent footprints from the work boots and rubber soles and one set of small bare prints that stopped 2 yards from where she sat. Her hair, dark and uneven where someone had cut it with kitchen scissors months earlier, had been brushed recently enough to keep one neat part over her left temple. Someone had once taken time with her. That was plain. The corridor belonged to the Bakersfield 5A Annex, South Wing, service level, where veterans with no appointments and nowhere to sit after midnight ended up under signage no one read. A flu-shot poster from 2 seasons back, curled from 2 corners beside a fire extinguisher. The coffee machine near the elevators flashed out of order on every 3rd cycle and then accepted money anyway. A floor map listed clinics that no longer existed in that building. Window 3, though closed at that hour, still buzzed from a failing fluorescent ballast that had been logged and relogged in maintenance notes for 11 weeks. Bureaucracy had a sound there. It sounded like electricity trying to hold itself together. She wasn't crying. That was the part that made the scene unbearable to anyone who stopped long enough to notice it. Her hands were open in her lap, palms up, fingers dirty at the knuckles, nails clipped short and clean except for a black line under the index finger on her right hand, where she had pressed too hard against something rough. Her rabbit's threadbare ear was folded across her wrist like a bandage. The hem of her dress carried a strip of dried grass seeds, the kind that clung at ankle height in empty lots. Her left sock had slipped halfway down, bunching at the heel. She had not fixed it. At 2:12, a janitor pushed a yellow mop bucket around the corner, wheels rattling over cracked tile seams, and slowed when he saw her. He stood there with both hands on the handle and watched the rise and fall of her shoulders for 3 full breaths, then parked the bucket against the wall, took off his own gray hoodie, and set it over her knees without touching her skin. He checked the badge scanner at the service door, looked toward the nurse's station, and kept going. At 2:19, an intake nurse in maroon scrubs stopped with a tablet pressed to her chest, looked down at the shoes placed side by side, and then looked away toward a phone ringing twice and cutting off. At 2:31, 2 contractors carrying a boxed monitor whispered to each other, moved around her in a wide arc, and never broke stride. Nobody asked her name. Nobody asked where her mother was. The building had protocols for almost every scenario except the one happening in plain view. Rain tapped at the narrow windows set high in the wall, each pane fogged at the bottom where cold met heat. The flag rope outside struck its pole in a fast, hollow rhythm. Down the hall, an IV pump clicked and reset, measuring time in tiny refusals. The girl slept through all of it with the stubborn concentration of a child who had practiced sleeping where she should not have to sleep. When she shifted once and her shoulder slid off the vending machine, she jerked awake for a second, pulled the rabbit tighter under her chin, and sat back up without sound. Then she closed her eyes again. By 3:04, a security officer in a Navy polo had typed an incident note into a terminal that froze twice before saving. Minor present, no visible injury, awaiting social work review at morning intake. He printed the report and clipped it to a board under 3 parking citations and a lost property notice for a hearing aid. At 3:17, he checked the corridor again and found her in the same position. Only now she had put her shoes 2 inches closer together, as if the spacing mattered. At 4:02, a respiratory tech passed with a portable tank and slowed enough to hear her breathing, then continued toward room S14, where a veteran with emphysema had already hit his call button 4 times. Institutional triage had its own gravity, and everything fell toward it. Dawn came thin and colorless through the high windows. The sky held that pewter tone Bakersfield got after night rain, when the light looked used before the day even started. At 5:46, a volunteer stacked plastic cups at the coffee station and found dollar coins jammed in the return slot. At 6:03, the first wave of walk-ins took seats beneath a television, with the sound muted, coats damp at the shoulders, papers folded and refolded in hands that had waited too long for too many signatures. The girl remained in the side corridor near the service wing, a quiet fact in the edge of everyone's vision, as if she belonged to the architecture. By 6:40, the bench nearest window 3 had filled, emptied, and filled again. A man in cracked brown leather took the same seat he always took, shoulders squared like he still expected orders, scar bright on his left cheek under fluorescent light. His name would be logged on a clipboard that morning and not called, the same as before, but that part had not happened yet. At 7:08, shift change brought fresh badges, clean pens, new coffee, and the same practiced pace around one sleeping child against a vending machine. The building kept running. That was its talent. Then later the number came first, 450. By 10:52 a.m., black motorcycles had begun to stack along the curb outside the annex in disciplined rows that stretched from the main entrance past the flagpole and around to the south service lane, each bike angled with inches between saddlebags, each rider in dark leather cut with old patches, and road salt still dried along the seams from desert miles. Helmets came off. Gloves came off. Engines idled low, then cut in staggered sequence, leaving a heavy quiet that made the front doors sound loud each time they opened. People in the lobby turned toward the glass and stopped pretending not to look. Eli Mercer at security had worked that post for 7 years. 2 tours in uniform before a knee injury moved him off patrol, and he knew the difference between noise and intent. He also knew what a crowd in leather looked like to administrators who only encountered them through incident reports and donor complaints. He lifted his radio and asked for supervisory presence at the entrance, voice level and clipped. Large group assembling. Count still climbing. He did not say riot. The word arrived anyway, carried from one receptionist to another like contraband. From inside, through rain-specked glass, the riders looked like a moving wall that had decided to become still. Some were gray-bearded and thick in the shoulders. Some were younger and restless at the edges. Most bore weather the way old buildings bore rust, visible and unhidden. Their boots were wet. Their denim held creases of long rides. One man cleaned rainwater from his mirrors with a bandana, and then stood with his hands open at his sides, watching the door without stepping closer. Another checked his phone once and put it away. No one shouted. No one smiled. The dread came from scale and silence, not motion. Inside the admitting office, a clerk in green scrubs whispered, "What did we do now?" And nobody answered because nobody knew which grievance had finally arrived in person. A charge nurse called facilities, then legal, then paused with the phone still at her ear when she realized both lines had already lit up with the same question. An administrator in a navy blazer appeared from the elevator, saw the line of bikes beyond the rain-streaked glass, and tightened her mouth in the way people did when they were preparing to be firm at a safe distance. The annex had spent years hardening itself against disruption, with signs, badges, and scripted refusals. Now disruption had parked in plain sight and removed its helmets. Across the lot, motorists slowed to count. A city bus passed, and 3 passengers stood to look out the right-side windows as the formation continued to grow. Workers on smoke break near the loading dock flicked ash into wet gravel and stepped back inside. Word traveled faster than fact. It always did. By 11:06, the number had been confirmed twice by 2 different staff members who did not trust each other's math. 450 motorcycles, 450 riders, 450 sets of eyes fixed on a federal building that had treated urgency like paperwork for so long it no longer recognized it when it arrived with chrome and old scars. People assumed they had come to break something. The truth was harder to admit. They had come because something had already been broken for years, and everyone in the building had learned to walk past it. Eli Mercer kept his hand on the radio and did not press the transmit button again, because years in uniform had taught him that some moments got worse the more words men poured into them, and because what he saw through the glass did not match the script now running loose inside the annex. A riot leaned forward. This line of riders held still. A mob looked for faces to challenge. These men and women looked at the building itself, at doors and corners and traffic flow, the way people studied ground before they built something on it. He watched one rider in a rain-dark vest step back 3 paces to close a gap in the curb line without being asked. He watched another point 2 fingers toward the south lane, then lower his hand when 2 bikes adjusted and sealed the space. No one revved, no one postured. Whatever this was, it had discipline at its center. By 11:09, the rain had thinned to a mist that beaded on chrome and leather and the annex windows alike, turning the whole frontage into a blurred mirror where staff could see fear on their own faces before they saw the people outside. Eli heard the clerk at window 2 whisper, "They're surrounding us." And he understood why she used that word, but his eyes told him something narrower and stranger. They were not surrounding the people in the building. They were surrounding the building itself, as if they expected something to come at it from outside as well as inside, as if they had shown up to keep a promise no one in administration even knew had been made. He lowered the radio and said, quiet enough for only the nearest nurse to hear, "Hold your posts. They're not pressing the doors." The nurse, Sandra Briggs, had worked nights in that annex for 11 years and had seen veterans pull out IV lines and men with panic rising in their throats punch drywall until their knuckles swelled like knots on old wood. She was not quick to panic. She was quick to observe. She moved beside Eli and peered through the rain-streaked pane at the line of motorcycles stretching past the flagpole, and said nothing for a long beat, the way she did when she was adding detail to detail before she chose a sentence. Her eyes settled on the far edge of the formation, where 2 riders, both women, had dismounted and were speaking to each other with helmets tucked under one arm, faces set, bodies angled toward the South Service entrance, where no one from the public was supposed to gather. Sandra finally said, "That's not random." Eli nodded once. "No." Inside the lobby, fear changed shape and became policy. Phones lit up, The charge nurse asked Legal if they could lock down without a declared threat. Legal asked whether any threats had been spoken. Security logs showed none. Facilities asked if they should close the loading dock. Someone from administration ordered all non-essential staff away from first-floor windows, then stepped to the closest window to keep counting helmets. The same system that could process denial letters with exact punctuation could not process ambiguity at all, and ambiguity stood 40 feet away in black leather, hands visible, engines cooling. Sometimes the people a city feared most were the only people willing to stand in weather for strangers they had never met. Sometimes reputation arrived first and character had to wait in the rain until somebody noticed it. Rick Sullivan sat on the bench by window 3 with his forearms on his thighs and his old flip phone closed in his right hand, thumb resting on the hinge where the plastic had worn smooth over years of use, and he kept his gaze on the floor map across from him because he knew what happened when frightened institutions made eye contact with the men they had already judged. 52 years had put weather into him the way weather got into wood. Not for show, just there. The scar on his left cheek ran pale and hard beneath the fluorescent buzz. His knees clicked whenever he shifted. His shoulders still looked military from habit alone. At the intake desk, his walk-in line still sat in the queue, with follow-up referral pending in neat block letters. The status had not moved. Outside, engines had. He could hear the riders through the glass even with the doors shut, a low mechanical breathing that filled the pauses between overhead announcements and printer chatter, and he tracked the cadence the way some men tracked heart monitors. He watched for drift, for agitation, for that first telltale move when a crowd stopped being a crowd and started being a problem. It never came. A rider near the center dismounted, checked his saddlebag, and remounted without breaking the line. Another lifted a hand, palm flat, and 3 people at the edge adjusted spacing by inches, then stilled again. Rick's jaw tightened once and eased. He did not see men looking for trouble. He saw men holding a line and waiting for a signal. The annex itself kept insisting on routine. A volunteer wheeled a cart of boxed sandwiches toward social work intake. The ancient copier by records jammed on page 7 of a benefits appeal and flashed a code nobody remembered how to clear without unplugging it for 60 seconds. Somewhere down the south wing, a sink faucet dripped with patient regularity into a stained basin that had been waiting on a replacement washer since September. The coffee machine near the elevators swallowed 2 more dollar bills and returned neither coffee nor change. Wet wool, antiseptic, burnt dust from old heaters, cheap citrus cleaner from the freshly mopped corridor outside lab services. The smells layered the way forms did, one atop another, until no single source could be blamed. In that place, neglect never looked dramatic. It looked procedural. At 11:14, Sandra moved away from the glass and headed down the service hall, with a stack of pediatric wristbands in one hand and a blood pressure cuff draped around her neck, because habit sent her toward tasks when uncertainty spiked, and because she could not shake the image of small shoes set side by side near the vending machine, as if the child who wore them was trying not to take up more space than she had already taken. The corridor lights hummed overhead. The floor had been stripped and rewaxed in uneven rectangles, and every seam in the tile held a black line of old grime no buffer reached. The staff supply door near the loading dock stood almost closed, latched but not flush, a narrow crescent of dark visible at the frame. Sandra paused there for 1 second and kept walking, not because she had forgotten, but because there were protocols and there were instincts, and she had spent 11 years learning how often those two failed to meet. Outside, the line grew denser without growing louder. Riders who arrived late cut engines at the edge of the lot and pushed their bikes by hand into position rather than break the pattern with fresh noise. Eli counted patches from 3 counties, 1 veterans support chapter, 2 independent clubs, and the same central insignia on most of the cuts. Worn thread, old stitching, names of towns in arcs at the lower back. No colors were hidden, no faces were covered. A man with a white beard and hands thick as mallets stood near the front and kept checking his watch. Then the south entrance, then his watch again. Impatience controlled down to muscle memory. Near him, a younger rider with a prosthetic left hand tightened and retightened his glove strap, eyes fixed on the service lane. They looked like people waiting for paperwork to clear. They looked like men prepared to stay until midnight, if that was what the paperwork required. By 11:18, the rain stopped altogether and left the parking lot shining like dark metal. Every oil stain came into focus. Cracks in the asphalt held thin lines of standing water that reflected boots and kickstands in broken strips. Beyond the lot, Union Avenue traffic moved with ordinary indifference, pickups and city buses and a landscaping trailer with one taillight out. The same Thursday flow as any other day in late November. The annex flag hung heavy with rain and no wind. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train sounded once, low and mournful, then faded behind the idling memory of engines that had gone quiet. In the silence after mechanical noise, people heard their own breathing. They heard the building settle. They heard how thin the walls were. Rick rose from the bench with one hand braced on his knee and turned toward the South Hall, every joint announcing itself in small clicks, and Eli saw him move and recognized him from check-in that morning. Cracked brown leather, folded paperwork in a manila envelope, the same restrained nod to staff that could be read as politeness or surrender, depending on who was looking. Men like Rick were easy to dismiss when they were alone. Men like Rick were easy to categorize when they sat in plastic chairs under fluorescent light. Out through the rain-marked glass, 450 riders stood in disciplined rows, and one current connected the bench to the curb even before anyone in admin understood the circuit. Eli did not know the reason yet, but he understood the structure of what he was watching. This was not a threat display. It was a response. In the service corridor, the vending machine still hummed warm air into space no one had claimed, and the janitor's gray hoodie remained folded on the floor, damp now at one sleeve from a tracked-in footprint, while the fluorescent above it flickered every 9 seconds, like a pulse the building could not regulate. Sandra stopped near the supply door and listened. The annex had 1,000 small sounds she could identify by instinct. Oxygen valves, elevator cables, rolling stools, chart carts, shoes. Under all of it, she heard something smaller, a cloth rustle followed by stillness. She set the wristbands on a counter, wiped her palms once on her scrub pants, and looked back toward the lobby where administrators still watched windows and security still held radios, and a man with a scar on his cheek was walking toward her with the careful urgency of someone who had run out of ways to wait. The paradox stood there in plain fluorescent light and wet November air, visible to anyone willing to look without flinching. The institution built to protect had spent years perfecting distance, and the people written off as dangerous had arrived ready to close it. Rick reached the bend in the service corridor as Sandra Briggs turned back toward him, and for 1 second they stood facing each other in the sour, bright wash of fluorescent light, both listening to the small sounds behind the half-latched supply door. The building breathed around them in familiar machinery. A distant elevator thud, the rattle of a linen cart, the thin electric whine of Window 3's bad ballast. Under that, the softer rustle came again, cloth against plastic, then silence. Sandra lifted her chin toward the door and kept her voice low. "I heard it twice?" she said. Rick nodded once and moved past her. Before she finished the sentence, she might have added, "The one about authorization and protocol and waiting for social work." He had spent enough years being told to wait that the word had started to feel like a bruise. Rick Sullivan had a way of moving that made people step aside without knowing why, not because he was fast, because he wasn't. Not at 52 with the knees that clicked and a lower back that seized when rain set in, but because his body had learned economy in places where wasted motion got counted later in pain. The scar on his left cheek pulled white when he set his jaw. The old unit tattoo on his right forearm had gone blurry at the edges, green-black ink sinking into weathered skin, and the letters below it, 2 initials and a date, had never been explained to strangers. His brown leather jacket was cracked at both shoulders and darkened by years of oil and weather. One cuff had been stitched by hand with black thread after a slide on wet asphalt outside Barstow. Nothing on him looked purchased for appearance. Everything looked used. In 1991, in a desert farther east than most men in that hallway had ever seen, he had learned the sound of incoming metal before he learned he was afraid of it, and a sliver of shrapnel had cut his face open while he was bent over a radio. No one could keep clear long enough to get coordinates right. He had packed gauze against his cheek with one hand and kept transmitting with the other because a convoy behind them had no water and no map that still matched the road. He never told that story at bars. He told it once in a VA intake room 12 years later and watched the case manager glance at the clock while he spoke. After that, he kept details to himself and gave systems only what systems could process. By the second week of December in the year he turned 37, he was home with a discharge packet, a box of medals still wrapped in tissue, and a marriage already splitting along lines he did not know how to bridge. He slept on couches when nightmares woke the house. He picked up machine shop shifts that started at 5:30 and ended when his wrists trembled too hard to hold a wrench. He drank too much and then stopped for 6 months and then started again. On a hot Friday in July, 15 years before this morning, outside a bar on Rosedale Highway, a man said something about soldiers who came back broken and expected applause. Rick hit him once, then again, and the second blow brought a concrete curb into the story. The man lived. Rick did 12 months in county for assault and came out quieter, with a parole officer who pronounced his last name like he was reading a serial number. The divorce finalization arrived in a courthouse envelope, while he was replacing a clutch cable in a rented garage behind a pawn shop. His sons were 12 and 14 then, both old enough to remember what he had promised, and young enough to believe promises still worked like locks. He made support payments when work held and missed them when work didn't, and the ledger of missed things grew faster than the ledger of repaired ones. By the time the younger boy turned 20, their conversations had reduced to 2 birthdays, 1 funeral, and a voicemail left at 1:18 a.m. that began with Dad and ended in static. Rick listened to it 3 times and did not call back until daylight. By then, the number had been disconnected. The club found him the way weather found tin roofs, gradually and all at once. He started with weekend rides, then road watches for veterans' funerals, then silent escorts for women leaving court, with restraining orders folded in purse pockets like paper shields. Men and women in patched leather gave him work without asking for biography. Set cones, hold a line, stand where you're told, keep your eyes open, keep your mouth shut unless you're asked. 20 years of road miles taught him where danger gathered in a parking lot, and how shame looked on people who had walked past someone in need. He learned phone trees, legal contacts, shelters that answered after midnight, which judges signed emergency orders before lunch, which county clerks required 2 copies and which required 3. Protection, he learned, was logistics before it was muscle. At 6:40 for 43 consecutive mornings, he had sat on the same annex bench with his manila folder on his lap and his name printed under walk-in request on a clipboard that changed pens but never outcomes. At 8:13 on morning 44, they had turned him away with a polite sentence about referral backlog and care coordination bandwidth, and he had walked to the parking lot with that old county jail heat in his chest, the kind that started in the ribs and climbed. He had not yelled. He had bought coffee from a machine that stole his $1, then fed it another $1 anyway, and he had gone back to sit because giving up looked too much like disappearing. Men like him disappeared all the time in institutional hallways. He had watched it happen. Now, at 11:19 on a gray Thursday in late November, with 450 riders standing outside in rain-damp formation and staff whispering at windows, he stood in a service corridor he was never supposed to enter and put 2 fingers on a staff supply door that did not quite close. Sandra touched his sleeve. "Rick," she said low, half warning and half request. He looked at her hand, then at the door seam. "You can write me up later," he said. The latch gave with a soft click. The smell inside was bleach, old cardboard, and wet wool that had dried slowly. Shelving units lined 3 walls, stacked with unopened glove boxes, absorbent pads, wrapped mops, and paper goods bundled in plastic that reflected the overhead strip light in hard white bars. A mop bucket sat near the back, dust traced in circles on its lid. Beside it, on flattened shipping cartons, sat the same small sneakers he had noticed near 2 a.m., pink stars gone dull at the toes, laces still tied in double knots. Next to them lay a stuffed rabbit with 1 button eye and 1 empty stitched oval turned toward the cinder block wall. The rabbit's torn ear had been smoothed flat by a careful hand. He did not see the child at first because she had made herself narrow, tucked in the wedge between the lowest shelf and a stack of bottled cleaner, knees to chest, dress hem pulled over her shins, dark hair falling forward in 1 uneven curtain. She was awake. Her eyes tracked him without widening. No cry, no flinch, no scramble for the other corner. That stillness hit him harder than panic would have. She spoke before he could clear his throat. "Please don't put me back in the chairs where he can see me," she whispered. The sentence was simple. It carried too much. Rick crouched, joints popping in a line from ankle to spine, and set both hands open on his thighs so she could see them. "I hear you, kid," he said. "You're not going back to those chairs." Behind him, Sandra drew 1 sharp breath, and then mastered it. She stayed at the threshold, not crowding the doorway, the blood pressure cuff hanging against her scrub top like an extra cord she had forgotten to set down. "Honey, my name is Sandra," she said, careful and plain. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl's gaze remained on Rick as if he was the only fixed object in the room. Her fingers twisted once in the rabbit's ear and stilled. "Emma," she whispered. Rick nodded. "Emma. Okay." He slipped off his jacket and laid it on the floor between her and the doorway. A soft brown rectangle across cold tile, not touching her feet. Just there, if she chose it. The leather smelled of rain and motor oil and old tobacco that had long since burned away. She watched the jacket arrive, then looked back at his scar. Children asked about scars when they believed they were safe enough for curiosity. She did not ask. That told him where she still was. Sandra took 1 step in and lowered herself to a squat, so her eyes came level with Emma's without blocking exit lines. "Are you hurt anywhere I can't see?" she asked. Emma shook her head once. Tiny motion, then placed her rabbit in her lap with both hands, aligning it straight like she had aligned her shoes. Order where she could make order. Rick knew that reflex. Men in prison folded towels the same way when nothing else belonged to them. A muffled voice sounded in the corridor, an administrator asking where Briggs had gone. Sandra didn't answer. She kept her attention on the child and spoke toward Rick without looking away. I need PD's triage room ready now. Rick rose halfway and leaned to the hall. Eli, he called, not loud. The security officer appeared 2 beats later, radio at his shoulder, face set. Rick held his gaze. Quiet route to pediatric intake. No lobby. Eli looked past him, saw the child and whatever official script he had prepared drained out of his posture. He nodded. South Hall and lab cut through. I'll clear it. In the next 3 minutes, the corridor changed function. Sandra pulled a fresh pediatric wristband from her pocket and wrote Emma in block letters with a black pen that scratched on plastic. Eli redirected 2 transport techs and a volunteer cart away from the turn. A nursing assistant named Lila, 24 and 6 months into her first hospital job, brought a warmed blanket from recovery and set it at Sandra's feet with both hands, then stepped back to the wall, eyes wet and jaw tight. No one raised voices. No one asked who was liable. Work replaced distance, one action at a time. Rick lowered again and held out his left hand, palm up, scar and all. You want to walk? Or you want me to carry you? He asked. Emma studied his hand, then the jacket, then Sandra, then the hallway light beyond the door. Walk, she whispered. She slipped her feet into her sneakers without untying the laces, heel first with practiced care, then reached for the rabbit and tucked it under her chin exactly as she had on the corridor floor at 2:07 a.m. When she stood, she was small, even for 7, shoulders narrow under the yard sale dress, socks mismatched by 2 shades of white. She swayed once. Rick moved his hand closer but did not touch her until she chose. She chose by putting her fingers into his palm and closing them there with surprising strength. He felt the weight of her hand, scarcely anything and everything at once, and the old instinct that had kept convoys moving and funeral lines straight and courthouse exits guarded came online before thought could argue with policy. He looked at Sandra. We move now, he said. Sandra nodded. We move now, she replied. They stepped into the corridor together, Emma between them, rabbit tucked tight, Rick's jacket draped over her shoulders like a borrowed roof. And as they turned toward the South Hall, the low, waiting silence from outside seemed to press against the walls, patient and ready, while inside the annex, for the first time that day, people stopped walking past. The South Hall narrowed where the old lab wing met pediatric intake, and the 3 of them had to move single file for a stretch, Emma's hand still inside Rick's, Sandra half a step ahead, clearing door swings with her shoulder, Eli behind them turning his body sideways each time someone came around a corner too fast. The annex smelled different away from the lobby. Less coffee and wet wool, more antiseptic and warmed plastic and the metallic tang that old heater vents gave off when November damp met dust. Fluorescents hummed overhead in uneven pitches, one long tube near the specimen window blinking in a slow pulse that made Emma's face appear and appear again beneath Rick's jacket. At 11:21, they reached the charting alcove outside pediatric triage, and the small procession stopped because a clerk had planted herself in the doorway with a tablet held to her chest like a shield. She was new enough that her badge still shone. I need authorization before intake, she said, looking at Sandra and not at Emma. There's no guardian present, and legal said... Sandra did not raise her voice. Legal can come down here and watch me log a minor who slept on our service floor, she said. Open the room. The clerk looked over Sandra's shoulder at Rick, then at Eli, then past all of them, as if the right answer might be coming from farther down the hall. I'm just following... Then follow this, Eli said. Door. It opened. Inside, pediatric triage looked like every underfunded medical room in the county. Laminated animal stickers peeling at the corners, exam paper torn and retaped on the table, a sink with a faucet that clicked twice before water came out steady, and a wall clock stuck 4 minutes behind real time. Emma stood just inside and did not sit until Sandra crouched and spread the warmed blanket over the only chair with intact vinyl. Rick remained by the door, one hand on the frame, eyes on the narrow wired glass panel set into it. In the reflection, he could see hallway motion, badges passing, shoulders turning away. Then the administrator from upstairs arrived, navy blazer damp at the cuffs from the rain she had crossed to get here. She stepped into the doorway and began with the polished cadence of procedural concern. We need a clear sequence of who observed the minor first, who initiated unsanctioned movement through restricted corridors, and why security did not. Sandra straightened and faced her. You want sequence? Fine. She pointed once toward the corridor they had just come through. From 2:07 to 11:19, 118 adults passed that south service stretch where she was visible. 118. I can give you rolls if you need to hear them out loud. The administrator said nothing. Sandra kept going, each word clipped clean. One intake nurse at 2:19. One respiratory tech at 4:02. One deputy dropping paperwork at 4:37. One pastor with a visitor badge at 5:11. Two social workers changing shift at 6:58. Three contractors with facilities tags at 7:24. One volunteer with a coffee cart at 7:46. 6 transport staff. 4 housekeeping staff. 99 more with IDs and clipboards and somewhere else to be. Every one of them kept moving. The clerk in the hall lowered her tablet by 2 inches. Eli looked at the floor. Rick watched the administrator's mouth tighten, loosen, tighten again, as if she were trying to decide whether this belonged in a report or an apology. She chose report. We'll review camera pulls. We already should have, Sandra said. By 11:24, the charge nurse had printed corridor traffic from badge scans and laid the pages on a rolling tray outside the room, timestamp columns running in gray blocks down cheap paper. Rick saw names he recognized from 43 mornings of waiting. Men who had called numbers and never eyes, women who had handed back forms without looking up. He saw one name from a church volunteer list taped near the chapel. He saw a patrol deputy he had nodded to in the lobby 2 days prior. The list gave the failure shape. It was no longer atmosphere. It was arithmetic. Emma sat wrapped in blanket and borrowed leather, rabbit under her chin, sneakers planted square on tile. She was not crying. That was the thing that bent the room around her. Lila came in with a pediatric vitals cart and froze when she saw the printed sheets stacked outside, and Sandra standing beside them like a guard at evidence. Rick caught Lila's eye and tipped his head toward Emma's socks, one ribbed and one smooth, both damp at the toes. Lila nodded, disappeared, and returned with 2 dry pairs from the donation cabinet, tags still looped with plastic. She set them down without a word. In the corridor, people slowed when they passed the open doorway now. Slowed and then looked again, because once a child had a name and a chart, and a nurse writing with firm strokes, indifference stopped feeling neutral. It started to look like choice. Rick stood in that doorway and understood, with the old cold clarity he trusted, that shame did not arrive when harm happened. It arrived when someone finally counted who walked by. Sandra finished entering Emma's initial note and set the pen down. I need one more thing for intake, she said gently, turning back toward the chair. I need to document what you're asking for right now. Emma did not lift her gaze from the rabbit's torn ear. Her fingers smoothed it flat once, twice, the same motion she had made in the supply closet. Rick moved off the doorframe and lowered to one knee beside her chair so she would not have to look up so far. He waited. The room held still around that waiting. Monitor idle light blinking, faucet ticking as the last drop fell, hallway printer spitting one page, and then silence. Emma leaned toward him until her forehead nearly touched the seam in his jacket collar. When she spoke, the whisper barely moved the air. "Don't let him find me." The words were short enough to fit in one breath and heavy enough to settle into every corner of the room. Sandra's hand tightened around the chart clipboard until the edge whitened her knuckles. Lila turned toward the sink and pretended to adjust supplies, shoulders rigid. Eli, standing just outside with his radio clipped high, looked away down the hall and set his jaw the way men did when they were trying to keep anger from choosing for them. Rick did not ask who him was. He did not ask where. He did not ask for details a 7-year-old should never have to produce before she got protection. He only nodded once, the movement small and deliberate so she could feel it as much as see it. "You won't be alone," he said. Emma's fingers climbed from the rabbit to his hand and locked there, thumb pressed over the old shrapnel ridge that crossed the base of his knuckle. Her grip was exact, no tremor, the grip of someone who had learned that requests disappeared unless attached to something solid. Sandra wrote one line in the chart in black block letters, paused, then added a second line and initialed both. Protective request stated by minor, immediate safety concern. At 11:27, the administrator reappeared with legal on speakerphone. Disembodied voice crisp through static, asking whether there was an identified threat and whether law enforcement had been notified. Sandra answered with institutional precision that concealed nothing. Minor requested concealment from adult male. Statement documented, security informed, protective intake underway. Legal asked for guardian information. Sandra said, "Unknown at present." Legal asked for social work, ETA. Sandra looked at Rick, then at Eli, then at the open hall where staff had begun to cluster without admitting they were clustering. "Not fast enough," she said, and ended the call. The room went quiet again. Rick stood, joints popping in sequence, and looked once through the wired glass toward the south service lane. Rain had stopped, and light from the overcast sky flattened everything outside into steel and slate. He could not see the curb from there, but he knew where each entrance sat, where each blind corner gave sight lines, where a child could be moved unseen if people moved with intent. 20 roadside years had mapped those calculations into him deeper than memory. He opened his flip phone with his thumb. The hinge clicked. In his contacts, some names were first names, some road names, some just towns and numbers and one-letter initials that only made sense if you had ridden long enough to earn context. He scrolled once and stopped at Cal Briggs. Vice President? Perimeter contact? The man who answered on the second ring when weather turned bad and a line had to be held. Rick glanced down at Emma. "I'm making a call," he said. She nodded without letting go of his hand. He eased his fingers free, placed the rabbit more securely in her lap, and stepped into the hall. Eli fell in beside him to the service door junction, then halted when Rick lifted 2 fingers chest high, old signal for hold position. Eli stayed there, broad shoulders filling half the corridor, radio silent for once. Rick pushed through the south service exit into air that still carried rain and diesel and wet asphalt. Under the shallow metal awning, droplets fell in regular taps from a bent gutter onto the concrete lip by his boots. The annex wall at his back radiated stored cold through leather. Beyond the chain-link fence, Union Avenue moved with indifferent midday traffic. No sirens, no urgency except the one standing in his chest. The rider perimeter was already in place beyond sight lines, disciplined and quiet. This call was for tightening, not summoning. He dialed. Cal picked up on the first ring. Yeah. Rick kept his voice low and flat, the way he had learned to speak when the message mattered more than the man delivering it. VA Annex, South Service entrance, he said. Perimeter's up. Tighten South Service. Little one needs a wall. He ended the call before Cal answered. For a beat, there was only the tick of water from the gutter, the thin buzz of the exit light above the door, and the muffled hospital sounds bleeding through cinder block behind him. Rick closed the phone, slid it back into his inner pocket, and stood with both hands open at his sides, eyes on the service lane, while inside the room a child held a one-eyed rabbit and waited for a promise to become visible. Rick closed his hand around the phone in his pocket and kept his eyes on the wet service lane, listening to the bent gutter tick out cold drops behind him. And for several seconds the world held to ordinary sounds. A bus brake sighing 2 blocks over, the thin whine of the exit light ballast above the steel door, a shopping cart clattering somewhere beyond the chain-link fence. Then a lower sound began under all of it, so low at first it could have been freight on distant tracks, and he felt it in the concrete through his boots before he trusted his ears. It came in layers. 1 engine, then 3, then a spread of cylinders sinking and unsinking as riders turned from side streets onto Union and came down in controlled lines. The vibration moved through the annex wall and into his back where the leather touched cinder block. It entered him the way artillery once had, not as noise but as pressure. His jaw set. His breathing slowed. Inside, Eli felt it through the panic bar of the south door and looked up from his radio without speaking. At the pediatric doorway, Lila paused with a stack of gauze in both hands and tilted her head toward the ceiling, listening. The administrator, in the navy blazer still in the hall with legal papers clutched against her chest, stopped mid-sentence when the windows began to tremble faintly in their frames. No one needed an announcement. Sound had already crossed the building faster than policy. By 11:29 on that gray Thursday in late November, the rumble had gathered enough body that people at the front desk stepped away from monitors and toward the glass in near unison, and what they heard made the annex feel smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. It was not chaotic throttle. It was coordinated approach, engines held low, pace disciplined, intervals steady enough to count by. Rick turned from the service lane toward the corner where the lot opened up and watched the first set of bikes round into view, headlights pale under the pewter sky, forks throwing beads of rainwater from chrome. Cal Briggs rode point on a black road glide with one saddlebag scuffed white. From an old slide, posture straight, face unreadable behind clear lenses. He did not look at the building first. He looked at lanes, doorways, rooftop cameras, the blind angle by the loading dock, then lifted 2 fingers once. The riders behind him split without a word. The sound deepened as more lines arrived from the north curb and the west access road, converging and then fanning, each rider taking a measured position with inches to spare between bars and bags. Tires whispered over wet asphalt. Kickstands hit in staggered clicks. Engines idled, cut, then restarted in designated pockets where running bikes were needed for quick movement. Rick had seen formations at memorial escorts and courthouse details. This was tighter. This was a field plan laid over hospital geometry. Eli came through the south door and stopped under the awning beside Rick, rain dampening his sleeves. He held a manual click counter in his left hand, thumb working by habit as each bike came into final position. 218 on this side, he said without looking away. Front team's got the rest. Rick gave one nod. Recheck. Eli raised the radio. Need hard count confirmation. All sectors. Static, then the reply from main entrance security, clipped and careful. Front and east perimeter, 232. Eli's thumb stopped on the counter. He did the sum out loud as if saying it gave everyone permission to believe it. 450. The number sat there between them with ceremonial weight. Around the annex, riders dismounted and moved immediately into function. No shouting, no milling. South Service took 40 bikes, angled nose out for departure, and 24 parked perpendicular to block direct vehicle access. 2 riders with medical patches unloaded orange trauma bags and set them by the door without entering. At the pediatric intake side, another line formed shoulder-wide gaps along the sidewalk, backs to the building, eyes on the street, turning themselves into an opaque screen that cut sight lines through the low windows. At the curb by Main admitting, bikes held a staggered double row that forced any approaching car to slow and be seen. From inside the lobby, staff pressed close enough to the glass to leave fogged ovals of breath. Some filmed with phones until supervisors told them to stop. Others simply watched, faces stripped of office expression. The clerk who had blocked triage minutes earlier stood at window 2 with her tablet lowered to her side, mouth slightly open, staring at the rows of leather and road grime and old scars arranged with more procedural discipline than the building had shown that morning. Cal crossed the south lane on foot, helmet under one arm, and stopped in front of Rick. He was 48, broad through the chest, hair gone iron gray at the temples, and his left hand had 2 fused knuckles from a machine shop crush 20 years back. His voice stayed low. Status. 7-year-old, Rick said. Ped's triage now. Asked for concealment from an adult male. No visual on him. Cal looked once at the south windows, once at Eli. We run privacy wall and controlled access. Nobody gets line of sight to that corridor. Eli answered first. Security can lock South Hall badge door and reroute staff through lab cut-through. Do it, Cal said. He turned and signaled with a flat palm, then 2 short points. The nearest riders mirrored it down the line, signal traveling faster than speech. Within 30 seconds, 8 women and 6 men shifted from bike positions to foot positions at measured intervals under the pediatric windows, each standing 1 arm's length apart, bodies angled outward to street traffic. Helmets came off and were set on the ground at their boots to keep faces visible to cameras. Hands stayed open. The wall became human. Sandra stepped through the south door just then with Emma wrapped in blanket, and Rick's cracked brown jacket draped over her shoulders, rabbit tucked under her chin. Emma saw the riders first as sound, her head lifting before her eyes found them, and her fingers tightened on Sandra's sleeve once, hard. She did not pull back. She listened. The engines nearest the service entrance dropped to a softer idle on cue, reducing the vibration to a steady floor-level thrum that no longer struck like impact. Rick watched Emma's shoulders ease by a fraction. Cal saw it too and gave another signal. 3 more bikes cut their engines. The rumble thinned, still present, no longer overwhelming. Protection adjusted to the child, not the crowd. Sandra kept her body between Emma and the open lane, while Eli keyed the badge lock on the interior side door. Route is clear, he said. No lobby exposure. A rider with a medic patch stepped forward 2 paces and held out a folded paper packet to Sandra. Intake consent forms and emergency advocate contact, she said. Already signed by our legal volunteer for standby. Sandra took it, eyes flicking over the top page. Who did this so fast? The rider looked back toward the curb where a woman in reading glasses sat on a parked bike with a laptop balanced on her tank bag, hotspot light blinking blue. Mara, she files faster than county servers. No one smiled. The work kept moving. At 11:34, a white pickup rolled down the service road slower than traffic and paused at the far chain-link gate, driver's face obscured by windshield glare. 3 riders nearest that angle shifted half a step, enough to block direct view toward the pediatric windows. Eli raised his radio and called for a plate check while keeping his gaze steady. The pickup idled for 4 seconds, then continued through the intersection without turning in. Eli listened to dispatch crackle back 1 minute later. No active flags, registered local contractor, no further passes observed. He logged the time on his notepad and slid it into his breast pocket. The detail was handled and closed. Inside triage, Emma sat on the chair with her shoes aligned exactly under her knees, rabbit ears smoothed flat across her lap. Through the wired glass panel, she could no longer see open parking lanes or strangers moving past. She saw leather backs and still shoulders making a living screen in the rain-muted light. She was not smiling. She was breathing in full breaths now, each one reaching deeper than the last. Rick stayed at the threshold, one hand braced on the door frame, tracking both corridor and exterior line. Cal took station beside him. For a while, they said nothing, just listened to the managed soundscape. Low idles at designated posts, radios clicking once and going silent. Hospital ceiling vents pushing dry air, chart printers spitting single pages. Mechanical system, all of them holding under load. At 11:38, the administrator approached with 2 compliance officers and stopped 3 feet from Rick, careful to keep her voice formal. Mr. Sullivan, we need to maintain federal operations. This cannot interfere with patient access. Rick did not turn fully toward her. Then keep patient access moving, he said. Perimeters outside your doors, not in your rooms. Cal added, ambulance lane stays open. Walk-in lane stays open. Sight line to that child stays closed. One compliance officer looked past them through the wired glass at Emma, then out at the line under the windows, then back to his clipboard. He checked a box and said quietly, mostly to himself, access maintained. The administrator held her papers tighter, nodded once, and stepped away without another argument. The wall settled into duration. Riders rotated every 12 minutes, so no one stiffened in cold rain for too long. Substitutes stepped in on tap and shoulder touch. Water bottles moved down the line in a cardboard tray. A pair of older vets from the formation took post at the loading dock corner, where cameras missed 10 feet of fence line. 2 younger riders handled traffic cones at the service turn to force slower vehicle approach and better camera capture. Nobody improvised. Each movement served visibility control, access control, and witness density. From the pediatric chair, Emma watched one gray-bearded rider kneel to tie his own loose lace and then stand back into position without ever glancing toward her window. The restraint mattered. The wall did not stare at what it protected. It guarded it. At 11:42, Sandra came out with Emma's initial chart packet, complete, and handed Eli a copy of the documented safety concern, plus temporary alias tag for hallway movement. Eli sealed both pages in a clear evidence sleeve, initialed the corner, and clipped it inside his incident binder. Physical record secured, external contact logged, no loose ends left adrift. Rick finally stepped into the room again and crouched beside Emma's chair. She moved the rabbit to one arm and reached for his hand with the other, fingers finding the scarred ridge at his knuckle as if it were a handle. Outside engines held their low, patient rhythm. Inside, the fluorescent above the sink still blinked every few seconds. stubborn and imperfect. But the corridor beyond the door no longer belonged to chance. It belonged to a line that had chosen to stand. Rick stayed on one knee beside Emma's chair while the line outside held steady, and Sandra came back in with a fresh wristband, alcohol wipe, and the careful expression she used when she was trying to make one small task feel ordinary inside a day that had stopped being ordinary hours ago. The fluorescent above the sink blinked, went dim, came back, and she waited for the bright phase before she touched Emma's wrist. Emma did not pull away. She kept her left hand wrapped around Rick's right, fingers set over the hard ridge of scar tissue across his knuckle, and watched Sandra write in block letters, Emma J., Dob unknown, temp ID verified. At 11:47, Sandra cinched the band, checked pulse with 2 fingertips, and looked up at Rick. "Hold still for me," she said, though he was already still. Emma lifted the rabbit with her free hand and pressed its torn ear flat against his sleeve, as if she was making sure both things she trusted were in reach at the same time. Lila stepped in behind Sandra with the dry socks, knelt and swapped them 1 foot at a time without asking Emma to stand. The old damp pair went into a clear property bag labeled with time, room number, and Lila's initials. Nothing got left loose. In the hall, Eli had turned the rolling tray into a chain of custody station. He clipped the 304 incident note from security, the badge scan printouts Sandra had demanded, and the dispatch log from the white pickup plate check into one evidence packet, then sealed it in a tamper-strip pouch and signed across the seam. He called County Child Response Intake on speaker with the door open so both compliance officers could hear. Minor identified as Emma J., 7 years old, immediate concealment request documented, no visible acute injury, on-site protective, perimeter active, pediatric staff engaged, requesting emergency placement order and non-disclosure. The call taker gave him a confirmation code. He repeated it twice and wrote it down where everyone could read it. CR-19-7742. Mara, the legal volunteer with reading glasses and the tank bag laptop, arrived at 11:52 carrying a slim accordion folder, already tabbed in blue, red, and yellow. She did not crowd Emma with questions. She asked one, quiet and direct. "Do you want your location kept private from the person you asked us about?" Emma nodded once. Mara marked the box, turned the form, and had Sandra witness the signature line. In the corridor, she connected to Hotspot again, filed the emergency non-disclosure petition electronically, then called the clerk's emergency desk and read the case facts in the same calm cadence she might have used to order lunch. At 11:58, a printer in records spit out the provisional order with the county seal at the top and a timestamp at the bottom. Eli added it to the evidence pouch copy set and carried originals to administration for immediate posting. At 12:03, Cal stepped to the pediatric window and gave 2 short hand signals. The outer ring shifted from tight readiness to sustained watch, riders rotating by pairs every 12 minutes, just as they had planned. No one crossed into ambulance lanes. No one blocked wheelchairs. By then, even the staff, who had started the morning whispering riot, had begun to use different language: perimeter, screen, escort corridor. Functional words replaced fear words. The janitor who had left the gray hoodie at 2:12 came in from environmental services with a mop handle in one hand and his badge twisted backward on his chest. His name was Mateo Ruiz, 59, night shift for 14 years. He stood at the pediatric threshold and nodded toward the folded hoodie on the counter. "That's mine," he said, then looked at Emma and corrected himself. "Was mine." Sandra asked if he wanted it logged and returned. Mateo shook his head. Put it with her things. Lila tagged it and added it to Emma's property sheet. One gray hoodie, donor release verbal, witnessed by R.N. Briggs. By 12:11, the administrator in the navy blazer had stopped speaking in polished hedges and started moving paper where it needed to move. She signed the internal incident escalation. She signed the camera retention hold so corridor footage could not auto-delete after the standard cycle. She signed the temporary restricted access map that kept sightlines closed to pediatric windows until county transport instructions changed. When she reached Rick's line on the witness sheet, she paused, looked at his scar, then at his hand still under Emma's, and asked, "Do you want to make a statement for the record?" Rick answered without standing. "Already did when I called for help." She held his gaze for a beat and checked the box for verbal statement adopted from security log. The clerk who had blocked the door earlier brought a fresh stack of pediatric labels at 12:18 and set them on Sandra's cart. She did not offer explanation, and she never said the sentence she had stopped in the middle of near triage. She only looked once at Emma's shoes, now dry and neatly placed together under the chair, and then she went back to window 2 where the queue had started moving again. Outside, the rain burned off into a bright overcast, and the flag rope that had snapped all morning hung mostly quiet in the damp air. Inside, distinctive failures began to disappear in plain sight under the pressure of witnesses. Facilities replaced the buzzing ballast over window 3 by 12:26. Maintenance finally fixed the loading dock latch at 12:34 and logged completion instead of pending. The outdated flu poster with curled corners came down at 12:41 and was replaced by a current immunizations notice and a county child safety hotline card. At 12:48, Eli taped the coffee machine shut, marked refund available at desk, and handed out $5 bills from petty cash to people who showed crumpled receipts or empty cups. The building could act fast when someone was watching. At 12:55, Veterans Advocate Denise Crowley from the county office arrived in person with Rick's emergency referral packet already stamped received. She found him in pediatrics and held out a single-page intake confirmation. "Sullivan. Richard J.," she said. "Emergency mental health referral open. Same-day triage slot at 2:20. Case number MH22308. Rick glanced at Emma, who tightened her grip when she heard his name. Denise followed his eyes and understood. "I can move the intake to this room," she said. "You don't have to leave her corridor." Rick nodded once. "Do that." By 1:17, both primary files were active in the state portal and printed to hard copy. CR-19-7742 for Emma's protection case, MH-22308 for Rick's referral. Eli logged where each copy went. One set to administration safe file. One set to county courier envelope. One set to Mara's legal folder. One sealed backup in security lockbox with his initials and time. Physical evidence had locations now, not just intentions. The two compliance officers who had arrived with clipboards stayed long enough to watch the system bend toward competence for once. One of them, a thin man with a wedding band worn flat and a coffee stain on his cuff, stopped by Sandra's station before leaving and said, "Camera pull confirms initial sighting at 2:07. No intervention entry until your team at 11:19. He looked toward the hallway where the vending machine still hummed and added, "That gap goes in the report exactly as is." Sandra nodded. "Exactly as is." At 1:39, county placement called back with verified kin contact. Emma's great-aunt, Delia Hart, licensed caregiver in Lamont, had cleared identity check and was en route with escort instructions to South Service entry only. Mara read the callback number aloud and had Eli verify it against dispatch records before anyone announced it in room. At 2:06, Delia arrived in a faded green cardigan with cracked reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, hands shaking until Emma saw her and whispered, "Andy." The shaking stopped. Emma did not release Rick immediately. She kept hold while Delia sat, while Sandra reviewed discharge to kin protocol, while Mara explained the non-disclosure order and had Delia initial each line. Then Emma lifted the rabbit and placed it in Delia's lap for 1 second, a child's version of trust transfer, and reached back for Rick again. He leaned in close enough for her to hear over the low engine thrum outside. "You did real good," he said. She looked at his cheek scar, then at his hand, and spoke the only thing she needed to settle. "You came back." "I stayed," he said. When Delia stood to leave at 2:24, Emma slid from the chair and set her sneakers side by side, straightening them before stepping in, the same deliberate double-check she had done on the corridor floor hours earlier. Rick took off his jacket from her shoulders and folded it once. Mateo's gray hoodie stayed with her property bag as promised. At the door, she reached up without looking and found Rick's hand again. He walked them to the south threshold where the human wall opened a lane exactly one person wide, helmets tucked down, eyes outward, no one staring as she passed. Engines idled soft. No cameras flashed. No one made a speech. Cal gave the demobilize signal at 2:31 after Eli confirmed Delia's vehicle had cleared the second intersection. Riders returned to bikes in practice sequence, outer ring first, window screen second, curb line last. The count left the way it came. Deliberate, exact. 450 in, 450 out. By 2:46, the lot was back to regular traffic, wet asphalt, and wind-moving wrappers along the curb. Rick sat for his 2:20 intake in a borrowed consult room off pediatrics, Denise taking notes, while Sandra finished chart closure 2 desks away. When he walked back through the lobby at 3:18, window 3 no longer buzzed above him. The line moved. His name had been called once that day and answered. For years, the annex had guarded doors, schedules, and liability, and still a child slept unseen on its floor. That Thursday proved the harder truth. Reputation can secure a building, but only character secures the people inside it.